But let's begin at the very beginning. I want to tell you the story of how survival came into existence. So imagine, if you will, that in the beginning, in the universe, there was absolutely nothing. Total emptiness or formlessness. Then, all of a sudden, a form appeared. The very first form. It was a thing. It was something distinct and specific. And in this case, let's just imagine, for sake of argument, that it was just a cloud of particles, like a gas cloud, out in the middle of nowhere, in this emptiness. So this gas cloud was like the first object, and there it was. But then, of course, the environment started moving around. There were other objects in the environment. There was wind and radiation and the pull of gravity and black holes, other things. And so, of course, all those are objects themselves, but we're just looking at this cloud. So this cloud, now that it's interacting with all these other objects, you see they pull and tug and warp and morph this form, which is the cloud, until it becomes something totally different than it originally was. Like, let's say the cloud had a certain shape, like it was a circular shape, perfect sphere. And then, by getting pulled by gravity and wind and stuff, it just, after a certain point, it completely dissipated, and you could no longer tell that it was a cloud anymore. And so in a certain sense, we could say the cloud died. Now, of course, the cloud wasn't really alive. It was just a shape, just a form. And it didn't really care about whether it was alive or dead. And in fact, so this cloud, it didn't have a sense of self. And it didn't have any desire to survive because it literally didn't care what happened to it. More than that, it didn't even know that it was a cloud. See, we as humans, we look at it and we project onto it that, oh, it's a cloud, it's a form. But you have to think more fundamentally. If there's no human to say that it's a cloud, does the cloud even know that it's a cloud? Obviously not. And so, of course, then it can't say that it should survive. Now imagine what happened a little bit later in the future, after this cloud died, is that some new form came into being for the very first time, and this form was different than all the other objects. This form had a desire to persist. It had a sense of itself. It could recognize its own form, separate itself out from the environment, and then try to maintain that form through manipulation. And so this shape, this form, lived significantly longer than all the other ones because it could manipulate. Like if wind blew at it, it could fly off to the side. If gravity pulled on it, it could maybe adjust itself and change itself to maintain its shape. And these, of course, became more successful, and they lived longer. But eventually they also died because there's only so much that you can manipulate your environment until the game of manipulation is over, and eventually you disintegrate. That's life and death for you in a nutshell. Now, notice a couple of very key things here that many people overlook, even though they're so obvious, is that a form does not have to care about persisting. And that, in fact, there's nothing rational or logical about caring to persist as any particular form. Nobody tells you have to persist. And also notice that for a form to persist at all, it must be able to distinguish itself and tell to itself what is it that is being persisted. So it has to crucially draw a distinction, the most fundamental distinction, the distinction between self and other. I am the form, and everything else is my environment. It's other to me. It's the world, other forms, or the environment as a whole. And so what I have to do to maintain my sense of self is to now manipulate either myself or the environment, and usually both, in order to make sure that that distinction between self and other is maintained. Because as soon as that distinction is lost, what happens to me? Now, since a form, any form, is a part of the entire universe, it is never in full control of its destiny, because just by the very definition that we created this distinction between self and other, there is an other which is distinct from myself, which can hurt me or which can have a control over me. By definition, I can't control that other thing out there because it's not me. I define myself as that which I can control and manipulate, at least directly. And then maybe I can indirectly manipulate other forces. But see, so the predicament that all life puts itself in is that it now has to play this game of defending itself against these external forces. And the reason it has to do that is because all forms are temporary and because reality is constantly changing. And that's a very important point about reality, is that it's constantly changing. No part of it is ever frozen or static for very long. And if any form totally changes, nothing of it basically remains. Because the form is what that thing was. That thing, whatever it is, this object that you're imagining, it doesn't have any existence to it other than the form that it is. So if we change that form too much, literally that change becomes its death. So what's being survived is the form. So fundamentally, survival is about maintaining a static arrangement of form, or you could say matter or energy, whatever you want to call it, a static arrangement within a sea of change. And survival is about maintaining order. And so disorder is an enemy of all living organisms. And disorder is your enemy as a human being. And in fact, one of the most dangerous things for an organism is freedom. People don't really understand the significance of what freedom is. They think freedom is a great thing, and they want to maximize freedom. But this is utterly impossible. You, as an organism, just by the fact that you're alive, are committed to restricting freedom. Because if you were totally free, you would scatter into a million pieces, you would disintegrate, and you'd be dead. So literally, freedom is impossible for human beings. Limitation, intelligent limitation, is what life is all about. So these calls for unlimited freedom, this is just complete nonsense, simplistic thinking. Freedom is what you're terrified of the most. And so the irony is that those people who call for maximum freedom actually they themselves are putting a lot of limitations on themselves and on life and on other people and on society in order to maintain themselves. So there's a deep hypocrisy there. But never mind, that's for another day. So basically survival boils down to not changing. So in a certain sense, just by being alive, you're committing yourself to not changing. You're committing to freezing certain aspects of reality. And then what aspect of reality you wish to keep frozen, well, that of course depends on how you define yourself, what kind of form you think you are. Survival requires a distinction between self and other. This distinction is not given to you from the outside as an absolute. So you might think like, well, Leah, I don't really know what's so profound about what you're saying here. Because, yeah, there are objects in the world, and of course they can get destroyed, and they can manipulate the environment, and they can live, so what's the big deal? You're assuming objects. There ain't no such thing as objects, is what I'm trying to get you to understand. An object is something that you project onto the world. It doesn't exist as an absolute. So that cloud, it didn't really exist until you said it was a cloud. That's what's so profound about this. And of course, you, the form that comes into being, you get to say what you are. Because the universe doesn't tell you what you are. The universe doesn't define your identity. You're free to define your identity however you want.